So last time we showed some demos of exercising an API, and part of the motivation for that was what's the sort of basic plumbing behind software as a service. We talked about the format of URIs and how the idea of RESTful URIs brings a little bit of order to what used to be chaos. We talked a little bit about the concept of a resource, and we'll have more to say about that now as we sort of wrap up this section. But kind of the high order bit from the last couple of segments is working with APIs is a life skill. And so learning to read the documentation, learning to figure out how you step through the API usage. For example, most APIs, you have to authenticate yourself somehow. It might be as simple as we saw with the MovieDB, where you're including an API key as part of the header, or it might be a more complicated sign-up flow where you have to do a couple of transactions, you get a token, and then you use that token. So reading the docs and understanding how authentication is done, if it needs to be done, using curl to try things out manually, it's much more productive to sort of debug these things with a command line before you try to write code that does them. And as we saw in the MovieDB, the API page often has a little facility where you can sort of see the code for trying out the API call either in curl or using the HTTP libraries of different languages. We also saw that you can use JQ as a way to pretty print the results, which most of the time is going to be a JSON data structure. And it's worth understanding how to do all these things, even if the API has native language bindings. So what do I mean by that last one? If I go back to the MovieDB API developer page, one of the links along the side says wrappers and libraries, and you can see there's a whole bunch of languages here. If I had clicked on the link for Ruby, and that takes me to a GitHub page that shows a Ruby gem. Recall that that's what Ruby calls libraries, that essentially wraps the TMDB API. What that means is that it provides a collection of classes and methods in those classes that essentially make it easier to work with that API. Most of the time, what they're doing is encapsulating the resources of the API one-to-one. So for example, in the TMDB API, a movie is one kind of resource. You can add a rating to it, you can get details about it. So the API wrapper makes it easier by letting you basically just use calls that look like this, right? Things that are sort of very code-friendly. Whereas if you were just doing raw, what I'll call calls from plain Ruby, if we go back to one of the random API calls, what we were doing previously is we were using the curl code on the side here to try out the commands on the command line. But if you click on Ruby, what you see is a way to actually do the same thing, but using the Ruby HTTP library. So this is sort of the lowest level way that you can use an API. You're making direct HTTP calls, you're getting back JSON data structures, you're manually parsing or manipulating that result in whatever way you want. But when there's a wrapper library available, for example, what you'll get back from some of these calls are objects that are already Ruby objects. Depending on the type of the call, you might get back a string, you might get back a hash with certain well-known keys. But basically, some of the wrapping has already been done for you, and you don't have to sort of deal with things at the low level of HTTP. So when there are native language bindings available, they can save you some time. But it's always worth understanding how the low-level calls work, because that's basically how you do your debugging. So the other thing that I think sort of emerges when you start looking at these APIs is this idea of resources, which actually turns out to be very powerful as an organizing principle for these kinds of apps. And I think what, because apps didn't used to be this way on the web, and until REST sort of took over as a way of thinking about how you organize an app, the way a lot of apps were organized were in terms of the actions. The user comes to the app, first they do this, then they do this, then they do this. And takes a little bit of a shift in thinking when you're designing an app to ask, what would the resource-first version of this design be? If instead of designing it around what the user does, I'm designing it around what are the things in the app and how are they manipulated? What are the resources? So for example, if I was looking at a generic e-commerce site, you might think the flow is the user arrives at the site, they search for something. Once they find what they want, they add it to a shopping cart. They put in their payment and shipping information, and then they finalize the purchase. That's what I would call an action-first description, because what it doesn't say is what are the resources that are embodied by the app that allow these things to happen. So if I go to a resource-first view, I might say, first of all, when the user arrives, they haven't put anything in the cart. So I'm going to create a cart resource and just mark the cart as empty because I'm going to need it later. Then searching for a product, what does that mean? Well, I can get an index of products. If you remember, the basic actions on a resource are you can create, read, update, delete, and index, which is a list. And searching for a product really is like saying, I want a list of products, but filtered according to some criterion. And the criterion can be whatever you want, but fundamentally, it's an index operation on the list of products, so on the product resource. And then when they add the product to the cart, well, that's just an update of the cart resource because you're now associating a product ID with it. And when they add payment and shipping information, well, that's probably kind of its own thing because you can say, well, a fulfillment resource is a thing that has all the information needed to finish the purchase. How are they going to pay? Where is it going to be mailed to and stuff like that? So you create a fulfillment resource, you associate it with the cart. And what does finalizing the order mean? It means that you just bind those two things together. You say there's an order resource, which indicates here's an order that's been completed, and it's associated with a cart. That's a list of all the things that are in the order. It's associated with a fulfillment resource, which says where to send the stuff and how it was paid for. So you're still allowing the user to do all the things. And from the user's point of view, they're still stepping through the same sequence of actions. But the way you design the app is very different. And the reason this is important, as we'll see, is that it makes it very clear in each step of the process what state has to be maintained in order to do the next step in the process. If you ask that question relative to the action first, you have to remember things like, well, if they search for a product and then they add it to the cart, now I have to remember what's in the cart. If the cart is itself a resource, just associating it with other resources is the way to do that. So a lot of questions about what state has to be maintained in order to continue whatever the user is doing sort of become clear when you've chosen the right mapping of resources to actions in the app.